The vault is already empty. The United States National Defense Stockpile contains 0 ounces of silver. Not a buffer, not a cushion, 0. This military machine cannot fire a Tomahawk cruise missile or operate an F-35 without the one metal it no longer controls. If you understand this structural hole, you understand why the next chapter ends with governments not buying silver, but seizing it. The legal mechanism to do exactly that has existed for decades and is currently being activated in slow motion. Hit the like button and subscribe for the structural analysis nobody in mainstream financial media is willing to build out loud. This is not financial advice. Everything here is based on publicly available market mechanics. Let's go to the beginning. For roughly 30 years, from the 1980s through the early 2000s, the Defense Logistics Agency conducted the most strategically reckless liquidation in modern history. The United States held a strategic silver stockpile of approximately 3 billion ounces. A reserve accumulated because planners understood that silver is a defense-critical conductor. It does not corrode. It cannot be replicated at scale by any other element. It is price inelastic because there is no substitute when a missile needs to hit a target. None of that mattered to the budget hawks of the 1990s. The stockpile was sold to paper over fiscal gaps. By the early 2000s, the vault was empty. Washington declared the free market would provide whatever silver the military ever needed. Until it was no longer free and the largest controller of that market was an adversary. Here is the structural problem nobody was willing to say out loud until very recently. China currently controls an estimated 70% of global refined silver supply. Not mining, refining. That distinction matters because you can dig silver ore out of the ground in Mexico or Peru, but if the refining infrastructure runs through Chinese-controlled capacity, the flow of usable metal is still a geopolitical variable that Beijing controls. And in late 2025, China added silver to its rare earth export control framework. That was not an economic decision. That was a strategic signal. A demonstration that the metal the Pentagon needs to fight a modern war is now a lever in a great power competition, and the side that emptied its vault is on the wrong end of that lever. But here is the part nobody fully understands yet. The mine seizure dynamic is not just about the United States. It is about what happens when multiple sovereign governments simultaneously conclude that their domestic silver supply chains represent a national security vulnerability and begin acting on that conclusion through legal frameworks that override market pricing. Because once that logic takes hold in one capital, it spreads to every capital that is watching the same supply deficit data. Stay with me, because this next part changes everything. The Silver Institute confirmed in February of 2026 that the global silver market is entering its 6th consecutive year of structural deficit. 6 years. The cumulative shortfall since 2020 is now over 820 million ounces. To put that in structural terms, the market has consumed more silver than it has produced for 6 straight years, drawing down above-ground inventories that are already finite and not being replenished at pace. Total global mine production is forecast to reach 820 million ounces in 2026, an increase of just 1%. Total demand still outstrips that by an estimated 67 million ounces in 2026 alone. And industrial demand, driven by solar photovoltaics, electric vehicles, grid infrastructure, and defense electronics, consumed 650 million ounces in 2026 alone. That is not a price signal problem. That is a physics problem. You cannot manufacture more silver from a deficit with a press release. Now layer on top of that the incentive structure that is currently trapping policymakers, and you start to see why this ends in intervention, not price discovery. The first structural force is what I call the critical mineral reclassification trap. When the United States Geological Survey officially added silver to the critical minerals list in late 2025, it did not just change how the metal is categorized on a bureaucratic spreadsheet, it activated a legal and policy architecture that has profound market consequences. The Defense Production Act, passed in 1950 and never meaningfully repealed, gives the President and the Department of Defense the legal authority to direct the output of any domestic producer of a critical material toward national defense priorities ahead of any civilian buyer at any price the government designates. That means a silver refinery in the United States can be legally ordered to redirect 100% of its output to a government contract before a single ounce reaches a COMEX dealer, a mint, or an industrial buyer in the private market. The market does not have to be physically seized in the dramatic sense. It can be structurally redirected through contract prioritization, effectively freezing civilian access while spot prices on paper exchanges continue to quote a number that nobody can actually transact at. This is what market seizure looks like in the modern era. Not soldiers at the door, but legal instruments at the refinery gate. The second structural force is the sovereign buyer problem, and this one has a self-reinforcing feedback loop that most analysts are not modeling correctly. When the Department of Defense enters the silver market as a restocking buyer, and the evidence now strongly suggests that a clandestine accumulation program began in 2025 under mandate from Executive Order 14,017, which directed a full review of critical supply chains, it does not behave like a price-sensitive investor. It behaves like a buyer with an infinite bid. The military does not care if silver costs $30 per ounce or $300 per ounce. Every cruise missile guidance system requires what it requires. Every radar array draws the current it draws. The defense application is price inelastic by definition because the alternative to acquiring the silver is not acquiring the weapons system, and the alternative to the weapons system is strategic inferiority. So when the Pentagon becomes a consistent buyer of physical metal on the open market, it does not respond to price increases by reducing its order. It accelerates its order because higher prices signal tightening supply, and tightening supply in a national security context triggers emergency procurement protocols that further tighten supply. This is a reflexive loop. The buying causes prices to rise. The rising prices confirm the thesis that metal must be secured before it becomes unavailable. The confirmation triggers more buying, and the loop has no natural circuit breaker because it is driven by security logic, not economic logic. The third structural force is the most dangerous and the least discussed: resource nationalism at the extraction level. Mexico is the single largest silver-producing nation on Earth, consistently responsible for approximately 23 to 25% of global annual mine output. Peru is the second largest. Both countries have spent the last several years developing legal and political frameworks around resource nationalism, the doctrine that strategic mineral extraction must serve the interests of the producing nation first and foreign buyers second. In Mexico, legislative and regulatory changes have already shifted the balance of control towards state-influenced enterprises. In Peru, political instability and indigenous land disputes have intermittently disrupted production from major mines. The structural point is this: the United States and its Western allies are dependent on silver supply chains that run through jurisdictions that are increasingly unwilling to be passive participants in a pricing and flow structure controlled from New York and London. When those jurisdictions begin to exercise sovereignty over extraction, whether through taxation, nationalization, export controls, or production quotas, the supply side of the global silver equation tightens regardless of what the COMEX futures market says the price should be. And because silver is primarily produced as a byproduct of copper, zinc, and lead mining, meaning roughly 70% of global output is not controlled by dedicated silver producers who can simply ramp production in response to price signals. The supply response to any shortage is structurally delayed and mechanically constrained in a way that has no precedent in more fungible commodity markets. These three forces, the legal seizure architecture, the sovereign buyer feedback loop, and resource nationalism at the extraction layer, are not operating sequentially. They are operating simultaneously. And they are interacting with a physical market that has been running a structural deficit for 6 consecutive years, draining above-ground inventory that took decades to accumulate. Now let's project forward using the causal logic we have established, because this is where mainstream analysis completely collapses. The dominant narrative in financial media frames silver as a precious metal with an interesting industrial story. Commentators note the solar demand tailwind, mention the deficit as a footnote, and then pivot back to the gold-to-silver ratio and the Federal Reserve interest rate cycle as the primary price drivers. This framing is not just incomplete, it is structurally wrong. It describes the pricing logic of a different era, an era when silver was a monetary metal and financial market conditions governed its behavior. That era is over. Silver in 2026 is priced at the intersection of defense procurement mandates, energy transition, industrial demand, geopolitical supply chain fragmentation, and a depleted stockpile that governments are now racing to rebuild. The gold-to-silver ratio is not the relevant framework. The relevant framework is, what happens to the price of a strategic industrial input when the sovereign buyer with the deepest pockets and the least price sensitivity enters the market during the 6th year of a structural supply deficit? The answer is not calculable from a chart. Policymakers face an impossible set of choices here that the market has not yet fully priced. If they move aggressively to restock strategic reserves through open market buying, they accelerate the price discovery that exposes how depleted their position is. If they suppress prices through emergency reserve sales, as has already been discussed in policy circles, they deplete whatever strategic buffer remains, potentially including the hypothetical future buffer they are simultaneously trying to build. If they invoke the Defense Production Act to redirect refinery output, they destroy civilian market liquidity, which creates a bifurcated market where the paper spot price becomes a fiction and physical premiums explode. And if they do nothing, they remain strategically exposed to a supply chain that an adversarial nation now has documented leverage over. There is no clean exit from this position. Every policy option carries a second-order consequence that worsens the underlying structural problem. The point we are at in the causal chain right now is late-stage concealment. The structural forces are already in motion. The legal mechanisms are already activated. The sovereign buying has already started, quietly, through channels that do not generate press releases. The resource nationalism pressure is already building in the two largest producing nations. The deficit is already in its sixth consecutive year. What has not yet happened is the moment when all of these forces become simultaneously visible to the broad market, when the paper price can no longer absorb the gap between what the market quotes and what physical metal actually costs to acquire at scale. That moment is not a prediction. It is a structural inevitability given the mechanisms already in place. The only variable is timing. Here is the blunt structural assessment, and I am going to be direct because this deserves directness. The forces currently operating on the silver market, sovereign restocking demand, defense prioritization law, 6 years of cumulative deficit, resource nationalism, and Chinese supply chain leverage collectively describe an environment where the price discovery function of the existing paper market is increasingly disconnected from the physical reality of metal availability. When a government can legally redirect refinery output before the open market sees it, when a sovereign buyer with an infinite bid is operating alongside retail and institutional buyers in the same constrained physical market, and when the above-ground inventory buffer that historically absorbed deficit years has been drawn down significantly, the pricing architecture that most investors are using to make decisions is built on assumptions that no longer reflect the underlying structural reality. Silver being up more than 180% year over year as of early 2026 is not a bubble signal. It is a belated re-rating of a commodity that was mispriced for decades because its strategic importance was obscured by its monetary reputation. The trajectory of these forces points in one direction, and that direction is not reversible without a structural shift in either the supply base, which requires years of permitted mine development, or the demand profile, which would require the reversal of electrification policy, defense modernization, and geopolitical decoupling simultaneously. None of those reversals are likely. What is likely is that the institutions and governments that understand this structural picture continue to accumulate ahead of the public realization, and the public realization arrives, as it always does, after the easy positioning has already been taken. Think carefully about this one final question and sit with it, because it does not have a comfortable answer. If a government can legally declare a metal to be a strategic national security asset, redirect its production through executive authority, and simultaneously prevent price discovery from signaling scarcity to the public, are you actually invested in silver, or are you invested in the government's permission to own silver? Those are not the same thing. And right now, most people holding silver still think they are the same thing.